Hello everyone and welcome to another Shadowlands Shaman video guide. My name is Barokoshama and in today's video we're going to be having a discussion for the changes happening in Elemental Shaman in 9.05, as well as general guide information and some nice tips and tricks on how you guys can increase your DPS and your overall damage in dungeons. Before we get started though, if you are new to the channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Like the video if you like it, comment down below what your thoughts are. It really helps with the whole algorithm thing. If you guys want to support my content, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page as well as my Twitch and social medias in the video's description down below. Without further ado, let's get right into it. With the most recent changes in 9.05, Elemental Shaman have actually received huge damage increases to our Earthquake, Earth Shock, and Chain Lightning spells, as well as a nerf to our Lava Burst and Echoes of the Great Sundering Legendary. Though because of these changes, more talents and builds have become optimal or considerable in Mythic Plus content, and even though they nerfed the shoulders, or the Legendary itself, down to 120%, because of the 70% increase to Earthquake's base damage, these shoulders are actually stronger, or the Legendary of Echoes of the Great Sundering is actually stronger now than it was before the patch, making it still a great option to use in Mythic Plus content. Many players, though, including myself, have opted to use a Legendary such as Skybreaker's Fiery Demise or Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence instead of Echoes, just due to the mechanical differences in the playstyles, and I also just don't like using Earthshock in AoE situations. It's very silly. Storm Elemental has also made a return with the patch in some cases, but should really only be used in an organized group scenario. Please watch my Skybreaker's Fiery Demise video here up in the cards somewhere. I believe it's over here. As well as in the video's description, I'll put it down there, where I go into more information and an in-depth discussion regarding the Skybreaker's Legendary and how to use effectively Storm Elemental. I highly recommend you guys go and watch that video, as it has a lot of information in it. So now that we've covered the changes to Elemental in the patch, we can now delve into the various playstyles and core information of the video. Alright, when it comes to gearing your Elemental Shaman for Mythic Plus, you want to try and really focus your attention towards Critical Strike and Haste gear, and try to avoid gear with Mastery on it. Versatility as a stat is still really good, as it scales with Lava Burst very, very well, and even in 9.05, where there was a nerf to Lava Burst by 10%, Lava Burst is still a large portion of our overall damage, and versatility scaling with it just makes it a good stat. Any gear that obviously has an intellect increase on it could be a potential upgrade, even if it has mastery on it. So depending on the value of intellect on that gear, some mastery pieces would still be an upgrade towards you. So ideally, you want to be above or around 14 to 16% haste, as it offers a comfortable casting speed as well as increases the tick rate of your Flame Shock. If you're using the Skybreaker's Legendary, this is really quite impactful as well. So due to Elemental Shaman also having the Elemental Fury passive ability, we gain really high value from our crits, and in 9.05, increasing the damage of our finishers, Earthshock and Earthquake, by a significant margin, crit has become even better, as it is one of the few stats that actually increases the damage of those two spells. So having a lot of crit is very beneficial, quite obviously, and myself, currently, as of the making of this video, I actually have around 30% crit, and I want more. So, just to give you an idea. For gems and enchants, you should follow the same kind of rules that we listed above. Specifically, though, for enchants for your chest, your bracers, and your weapon, you definitely want plus 30 stats to your chest, plus 15 intellect to your bracers, and celestial guidance to your weapon. Intellect is our best overall stat, And if you want to know how to better simulate your character for Mythic Plus, please check out my guide on YouTube. I'll link it in the cards up here, as well as you can find it in the video's description down below. Moving over to talents, level 15 row. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Echo of the Elements is still our strongest talent on the first row, since a large portion of our overall damage is still coming from Lava Burst, even with the nerf in 9.05. So run this talent pretty much until further notice. You could make a case for Earth and Rage once we reach a certain percentage in our crit rating, and /or while you're running the Storm Elemental talent, because during that talent you would likely want to cast less Lava Burst depending on how many stacks of the buff it provides that you have. So Echo of the Elements could potentially fall out at some point, but run it until further notice. Over at level 25, Aftershock will be our go-to for dungeons, as it yields just the biggest AoE increase potential, as well as it synergizes very well with Echoes of the Great Sundering Legendary, which is a very strong legendary to bring into Mythic Plus. The free Maelstrom resets are quite big if you get lucky back-to-back procs, and especially with the buff to our spender spells in 9.05, the massive free Maelstrom generation we get from this talent is even stronger now. So just, yeah, it's really freaking good. Even though it's RNG, Aftershock pulls ahead pretty much all the time in Mythic Plus. The level 30 row. This talent is kind of up to personal preference. Run Spirit Wolf for increased movement speed and damage reduction. Run Earth Shield to put on the tank or yourself for additional healing. And you could also run Static Charge for more utility in the group. For level 35, Master of the Elements is really useful right now, as its flat damage increase on Earthquakes and Earth Shocks is even stronger now. 20% of a higher number is an even higher number. Wow, no figure. Also, consuming the buff on your Stormkeeper Lightning Bolts yield very strong single target burst. Storm Elemental can be used, as well as it synergizes well with the Skybreaker's Fiery Demise Legendary. Although I don't recommend using Storm Elemental unless you are in or within an organized group and environment to really bring out the most of the talent, as it requires a lot of micromanaging, payoffs, and setups. Okay. Level 40. Nature's Guardian is the default choice here. Historically, Shamans are very squishy, so having an extra little survivability to put into your kit works well. Whereas Ancestral Guidance can be used if you are confident in your gameplay and you want just a little bit of extra healing to help your healer out during Pridefuls, big AoE, and damage situations. And Ancestral Guidance should be paired with offensive cooldowns to make the most out of the heal that you could get. Row 45. Primal Elementalist gives increased AoE damage with your Fire and Storm Elemental, new abilities that it comes with, and the extra defensive cooldown that you get with your Earth Elemental, your Primal Earth Elemental, called Hardened Skin, is really, really powerful. I would recommend pretty much only using Primal Elementalist in all situations in Mythic Plus, as it is the most versatile talent on the row. We benefit most from the extra defensive, as Shamans lack a lot of survivability, and value the added damage that we get from our offensive elementals. So, Primal Elementalist, really freaking strong. Level 50. Stormkeeper. Kind of the no-brainer. Run it all the time until further notice. Always use this talent in dungeons, pretty much no matter what. In its current form, it's just far too versatile and powerful to argue otherwise, as it brings increased AoE, Maelstrom generation, single target and burst priority, and instant casts, giving us more mobility. Easy choice. Let's move on to the next chapter. There is a great piece of extra info in Mythic Plus, and that comes with making sure that your cooldowns, like during your cooldowns, you line up the biggest damage and biggest value that you can for them, like that you possibly could for them. So this means using Stormkeeper or Storm Elemental with unused trinkets like the PvP badge or Soul Letting Ruby, just to give a couple examples. Soul Letting Ruby is a trinket from Theater of Pain. Big crit buff that you can get from that trinket. If you are within the Necrolord Covenant and are using the Storm Elemental talent, consider using the Emily Soulbind, as she comes with the Intellect buff, Lead by Example, whenever you use your Primordial Wave Covenant ability. This strong Intellect buff can line up with your cooldowns quite well, but you may also want to opt into just using Bonesmith Hymir for the 3% passive Intellect that comes with it, and the Bonesmith Arsenal Marrowed Gemstone in crit buff, actually. That once you land 10 critical strikes, you gain 18% critical strike rating for 10 seconds. You can no longer game this buff, unfortunately, and reset the procs using a cancel or macro because they hotfixed that quite recently, but the crit buff itself could be useful if it procs during your burst window situations. While using Storm Elemental and Skybreaker's combo, you also need to keep in mind the cooldown reduction capabilities of the Skybreaker's legendary. So this means in some situations, it is worth to continue to spread and maintain Flame Shocks even during your Storm Elemental window, depending on if you need your Storm Elemental to be up for the next pack, or to be available for the next big pack. You know you have two big back-to-back packs, you may need to consider Flame Shocking and maintaining those Flame Shocks during that window, instead of just spamming Chain Lightnings and Earthquakes, so that you have Storm Elemental up for both of them. So essentially, familiarize yourself with the timings of Storm Elemental, the timings of cooldown reduction, capabilities of legendaries, the timings of using cooldowns together to stretch the limits and damage potential of those. And the moral of this section is that timing is key when using your CDs, pretty much. One of the biggest damage increases in dungeons, going from mob pack to pack, is actually going to be pooling your Maelstrom resources in anticipation for the next pull. I see so often this not being done or practiced by other Elemental Shaman, and it really does make a huge difference. If the current mobs that you're fighting are like 20% HP or lower, consider how long you have left in the combat scenario, or until combat drops and you start to lose Maelstrom, or you just don't have any Maelstrom. This will help you decide whether you need to start saving or not spending your Maelstrom and pooling it for the next pack, and generating as much of it in anticipation for that next pull. That way you start off the next pull with a Earthquake right away on the ground, or if you're running the Echoes of the Great Sundering Legendary, you can start off with an Earth Shock, right? So that your next Maelstrom generating or Maelstrom generator spell is the Earthquake, so you're already one step ahead. And a common practice for top shamans as well is to start the key pooling Maelstrom. You could use this by either pulling mobs in the dungeon, or you could use something like a turnip punching bag or another toy. Pull Maelstrom, drop combat, put the key in, essentially. Easy fix. Will take some getting used to, but it's such a big difference in Mythic Plus. This is quite a big mistake that I see a lot of players do as well when it comes to Mythic Plus. A lot of players will not change the rotation based off of how many mobs that they're playing. An example of this would be quite often you can find yourself fighting like 5 to 6 enemies, right? And so you're doing your rotation based off of how many enemies are there. Chain Lightning, spam, Earthquake. Great. But at some point in that pull, 2 of the mobs die, 2 or 3 of the mobs die, and you're still just casting Chain Lightning and Earthquakes. You need to be able to read the situation before it happens. Familiarize yourself with the HP values of mobs in dungeons and start to change your rotation mid-pull when you start to notice that mobs are going to be dying. So you can do this by prepping some Flame Shocks on the higher health mobs, getting that 3-target rotation scenario ready so that when the mobs do die, you're already getting Lava Surge procs and you can move smoothly into that 3-target scenario. Keep in mind, though, that in 9.05, it is now a DPS increase to actually use Chain Lightning on 2 targets instead of the 3 targets we were using back in 9.0. So, change up your playstyle slightly to accommodate the changes. All right, proper AoE rotations and openers. This is going to be the longest chapter of the video, so I'm going to split it up into 2 parts. The first, we will cover the Echoes of the Great Sundering legendary, and the second, we will cover the use of Skybreakers. I'm going to tell you how you can open up on enemies, but also kind of your thought process as you're using each of these legendaries. There's so many different ways that you can do your openers based off of the legendary, using the talents that you're set up, Maelstrom that you have going into the pull. All of these play a part into that. So I've prepared several opening sequences that yield strong burst windows, assuming you have chosen the Necrolord Covenant, because it's the most versatile for Elemental Shaman and Night Fae. Even though they do get Night Bays, their strengths only rely on their soul vines. The goal, like I mentioned in the previous cooldown usage chapter, is to get the biggest bang for your buck during your cooldowns, and opening up properly is going to yield that. I want to make a quick side note for Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence. Though it is definitely still viable to run the legendary, you're getting less value from your AoE side of things. And the opener is so similar to the Skybreakers that I didn't feel like I needed to put a whole nother section in here based off of just repeating information. So Windspeakers, very, very easy opener. Just compare it to the Fire Elemental opener itself, and you'll yield the same or similar results when it comes to that opener. If you are a part of the Venthyr or the Kyrian Covenants, your opener is going to be very, very similar, except you're just going to be using your Covenant ability either earlier on within the pull, just weave it in there, or use it when it comes off cooldown as well, as it adds additional AoE damage in the form of Chain Harvest for Venthyr and Vesper Totem for Kyrian. If you are part of the Night Fae Covenant, your openers are the exact same as well, except no Primordial Wave, obviously, and Lava Burst integration. And I would actually not recommend using the Fae Transfusion ability within AoE unless you need the healing portion of the ability itself to help your group or healer. The Fae Transfusion ability is extremely powerful when it comes to Prideful or even Grievous. I've been doing a lot of testing this week, and the additional healing paired with Ancestral Guidance is extremely powerful when paired with Fae Transfusion, so keep that stuff in mind, guys. Okay, let's get into Echoes of the Great Sundering. The biggest priority you want to focus on with Echoes of the Great Sundering is buffing your empowered Earthquakes from the Legendary with Master of the Elements. So spreading enough Flame Shock dots throughout combat scenario to get Lava Surge procs is important when it comes to actually using those procs to just increase your damage. In a perfect scenario, you want to have enough Maelstrom to either Earthquake or Earthshock, depending on what legendary buff you have up already, or if none at all, right away just to get going. So I mentioned this back in Maelstrom management section or portion of the video. So if you don't have enough Maelstrom approaching the pull, you'll want to generate Maelstrom quickly as possible with Chain Lightnings while you're spreading your Flame Shocks and essentially prepping for your burst window. Use Stormkeeper right away as well in your opener if you have little to no Maelstrom, as Stormkeeper is your main Maelstrom generator in your opener, and it is a DPS increase to actually empower the Chain Lightning cast of Stormkeeper. It is a DPS increase to empower them with Master of the Elements as well, but be careful not to prioritize Stormkeeper Chain Lightnings over your Earthquakes that are empowered by the Legendary. It is better to hold a Lava Surge proc or to hold the Master of the Elements buff for the big Earthquakes than to use it on your Stormkeeper empowered Chain Lightnings. However, if your next Maelstrom dump, let's say, is an Earthshock, and you want to empower your Stormkeeper Chain Lightning, you can do that as long as you're not skipping over the Earthquake. Primordial Wave is a unique ability to squeeze into your rotation within an AoE scenario. It's a little finicky, but if you use it smart, it yields good results. It should be used to spread additional Flame Shock dots, but also to generate large amounts of Maelstrom quickly, and ideally, you want to consume the Primordial Wave buff while you have 3 or more Flame Shocks out to get at least 40 Maelstrom by consuming that dot. And then you will get the Master of the Elements buff. Master of the Elements. Oh, what do we want to use this on? Earthquakes. So you should also consider using the buff at the most opportunistic moment For that, your next cast, as soon as you've gotten enough Maelstrom, is actually an Empowered Earthquake. So, consuming the Primordial Wave buff to generate enough Maelstrom before your Empowered Earthquake cast is the preferred way to use the spell. Your Fire Elemental is a cooldown that can be used pretty liberally and pretty much on CD. It doesn't really impact your AoE DPS that much, and can be used in conjunction with Primordial Wave to yield larger lava bursts due to the increased duration on your flame shocks while it's active. But your single target spell priority rotation has not changed with this legendary. Use your generator spells to build Maelstrom, then your spender spells to dump it. It's still very, very similar. You want to buff your Earth Shocks, you want to buff your Earthquakes, and your Stormkeeper Empowered Chain Lightnings with Master of the Elements as often as you can, and refrain from overcapping your Maelstrom. Having explained the ideal situations, as well as how the spells interact with each other, we can now hop into your opener and what it's going to play out like. Spell cast tracker can be seen on the screen to better showcase the spell queue that I'm doing here, as well as I will be explaining the opener rotation in the ideal situation of having at least 90 Maelstrom going into the pull and being able to Earth Shock right away, essentially. So if you need more information about the rotation variances based off of how much Maelstrom you have going into the pull, I suggest joining my Discord community and heading over to the Barako Guide channel, where I have all of that information displayed neatly in picture format. At the start of the pull, you want to precast your Fire Elemental and start by applying Flame Shocks to a higher health target. We now want to buy time for Flame Shock to come off cooldown, so your next spells will depend on the Maelstrom that you have going into the fight. Now we will cast our first Earth Shock into a Chain Lightning cast, then Lava Burst. This Lava Burst is going to play into an Earthquake later on. We want to now cast our Stormkeeper spell into your second Flame Shock, as it's likely going to be off cooldown now. You can then use Primordial Wave on your third target, just to keep spreading your Flame Shocks. Use any unused trinkets, intellect potion, racials that are going to benefit your character's damage, okay? And now we can drop our first Empowered Earthquake. First Lava Burst that we casted before, going to have us Master of the Elements, buff the Earthquake. Boom, it's down. We have now cast a Chain Lightning into an Earth Shock. We get the Empowered Earthquake buff again. And then if you have Flame Shock off cooldown again now, you can Flame Shock the fourth target, or just Lava Burst into another Earthquake. Lava Burst is going to spread Lava Burst onto all of the targets affected by Flame Shock because of our Primordial buff that we used before, giving us enough Maelstrom, Master of the Elements, to use on our second Earthquake. Now we can cast Chain Lightning again into an Earth Shock and continue our AoE priority spell rotation. This opening sequence plays into empowering your first Earthquake as early as possible and ensuring your Stormkeeper burst window has the biggest stat increase possible from soulbind abilities, as well as any buffs that you would put on yourself, right? So the opener will be slightly different depending on how much Maelstrom you have going into the pull. Your opening rotation will also need to be adjusted based off of things like the amount of procs that you're getting from Aftershock or Tumbling Waves. There are times where you can just get an absurd amount of procs from these abilities and resets, and things become daunting. Just slow down your thinking of it, practice often so you can kind of traverse these moments optimally. The Skybreaker's Fiery Demise. So this build revolves around spreading and maintaining your Flame Shock dot on as many targets as possible, based off of how often you need your Fire/Storm Elemental cooldown up. The Fire Elemental build can maintain more Flame Shock dots and yield higher sustained damage within the whole Master of the Elements buffing Earthquakes things, and priority target spells as well, like Storm Keeper Lightning Bolts and Earth Shock. But the Storm Elemental build yields higher upfront burst windows, which can be beneficial for the current tank kiting meta, where tanks can't really stand still and just face tank things. Most tanks anyway. I know Guardian Druids are really good at that right now, and also depending on the affixes of the week. Though it is arguably harder to play Storm Elemental due to the requiring more micromanagement playstyle. Let's first start off with Fire Elemental. So your Earthquake spell, because we're going to be running Fire Elemental, this also means you're running Master of the Elements. And your Earthquake spell takes priority of using Master of the Elements on it. this build, and you should buff it as often as possible when using talent. So you can also get much more value out of Primordial Wave while your Fire Elemental is out, because your Flame Shocks last longer. You can maintain more of the Flame Shock dots. So this also means hard casting Lava Burst in an AoE situation is not advised unless you're consuming Primordial Wave buff to send out multiple Lava Bursts at once. So don't hard cast Lava Burst in order to get a Master of the Elements buff. This also applies to Echo of the Great Sunburn. Your main Maelstrom generation will also still come from the Stormkeeper talent. In AoE and outside of Stormkeeper, your building and spending of Maelstrom is very straightforward. Build Maelstrom with Chain Lightning and spend it on Earthquakes in AoE combat. So your single target priority spell rotation is also not changed with this legendary. It's very, very similar to Echoes. You want to buff your Earth Shocks, your Stormkeeper empowered Lightning Bolts with Master of the Elements, and refrain from overcapping your Maelstrom. So start your opener by precasting Stormkeeper and Fire Elemental. If you have enough Maelstrom going into the pull, you can hardcast a Lava Burst into a Flame Shock to give yourself that Master of the Elements buff and drop the Earthquake right away that's empowered. Drop your first Earthquake and build Maelstrom up with Chain Lightnings and cast Flame Shock on your second target. If you had no Maelstrom going into the pull, this is where your opener would essentially start. So on your first Chain Lightning with Stormkeeper. Try to empower your Earthquakes with Lava Surge procs only. If you can use Primordial Wave on your third target, definitely do so. Spread the Flame Shocks and cast an additional Flame Shock on your fourth target. Your Flame Shocks are going to be lasting super long because of your Fire Elemental. And it would be okay to hardcast Lava Burst to consume the Primordial Wave buff here. You'll also generate enough Maelstrom to pretty much Earthquake again here, as well as it will be buffed by Master of the Elements. Continue to do your AoE priority spell rotation and spread additional Flame Shocks dots in reaction to Tumbling Wave procs, if necessary, or just to get the cooldown on Fire Elemental up again, because you can have so many of them, and ticking down with Skybreaker's legendary cooldown reduction can happen quite fast with Fire Elemental. So, like the Echoes of the Great Sundering opener, this one plays into empowering your Earthquakes, as I said, as often as possible, and it also allows you to have more of them active because you're spending less Maelstrom on Earth Shocks, or you're not splitting your Maelstrom generation into Earth Shocks and Earthquakes. So the utility part of Earthquake really shines through here, as you're going to be getting more and more knockdowns because you'll have more Earthquakes out, and they do not DR with each other. So happy spam knockdowns. Let's move on to Storm Elemental. Your opener for Storm Elemental is a little bit more fast-paced and hectic, as you need to be keeping track of various buffs and timers and make the most of the burst window itself. So earlier in the video, we talked about stacking your cooldowns and buffs to get the most out of them, and this plays into Skybreakers. Earthquakes, spam Eye of the Storm, and using your Stormkeeper on use badge, Soul Letting Ruby, the PvP badge trinket, what I meant as well, all at the same time, yielding massive amounts of burst AoE damage. It's insane. When timing your Storm Elemental, it's also important to understand the route of the dungeon and whether or not you need Storm Elemental to be available for the next pull. Can you use it here on this one pull, or spread and maintain Flame Shock dots while that Storm Elemental is up during that burst window, and then have it back up for the next pull that you may need it on? Answering that question comes with practice, it comes with experience, but this is mainly why it is only recommended to play Skybreakers and Storm Elemental together in a well-organized group, because that communication needs to be happening. Assuming you have enough Maelstrom going into the pull to drop an Earthquake right away, you will start the pull off by precasting your Stormkeeper, summoning your Storm Elemental, and spamming Earthquakes and Chain Lightnings. Wait for your Storm Elemental, this is important, wait for your Storm Elemental to empower itself with its Call Lightning ability before you have it cast Eye of the Storm, or you will waste all of its damage potential. Call Lightning will always be the Storm Elemental's highest priority spell in its own APL list. And if the buff it provides is not on the Elemental, Call Lightning will be its next cast, essentially. If you need the Elemental for the next pull, Spread and maintain Flame Shocks. Pretty much cast Flame Shock on cooldown, right? Utilize your Primordial Wave to also spread additional Flame Shocks and consume the Primordial Wave buff at 4 Flame Shocks to yield the highest amount of Maelstrom generation and damage. There will be a short window to do that, though. I think your 4th Flame Shock has about 2 or 3 seconds left on it within that 4 Flame Shock Lava Burst spread window. So if you don't need Storm Elemental for the next pull, kind of let your Flame Shocks fall off and just spam Chain Lightnings and Earthquakes, alright? But it is still a damage increase to get that 4 Lava Burst spread Primordial Wave buff window out there. So put that in your pull. The rest of the pull is continuing your AoE rotation and just getting out as many Earthquakes as possible while adjusting to the mob count and prepping for the next pull. Alright. This concludes the patch 9.05 Elemental Shaman Mythic Plus guide. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider supporting the content that I create along with my editors by visiting my Patreon page and my Twitch channel, streams, my social medias, all those pages. All the links to that will be in the video's description down below. I hope you liked the video. I hope it was helpful towards you. I hope you guys learned some stuff from it. Please comment down below what you guys think of the video, and I'll try my best to answer each comment. Like the video if you like it. Subscribe for more Elemental Shaman and Shadowlands content in the future. And remember, keep calm and Maelstrom on. Bye-bye.